Okay, now you are good to go.
Okay, I'd like to start the meeting, and I'm having a little bit of problem accessing. Can you call the roll based on who you see?
You can call a full roll for your committee. I have Councilmember Rafter,
Here.
Councilmember Murphy,
Here.
Councilmember Ritzberger,
Here.
and then Councilmember Lepari Shu. Here. You have a full committee.
Okay. Then I'm having issues getting through to this meeting because I'm only on my phone. But since to my knowledge, there's been no change in the agenda, and the only thing we have on the agenda is to just discuss short-term rental. Is that correct?
Correct. And then if anybody has any changes to the March 9 meeting, I could ask for them now.
I have nothing.
Yeah, I looked over. I think it looks pretty good. March was
Yeah, I
a
have
little
no
ways ago,
changes.
but I think it looked good.
Okay.
Okay.
So we can proceed with the agenda item.
Hey, John, Gary just popped on. So Gary's here too.
Okay, good. Gary's present at the meeting. And who else is here?
You have code
Stephen,
enforcement.
Stephen, good. All right. The reason I wanted to get this onto the agenda was it was my observation on the zoning board agenda that I received that there were two short-term rental properties that were applying for a variance. Owners of two properties applying for a variance.
I think there's three, actually.
I have not seen that.
Oh,
Is
okay.
there a new agenda?
A link went out the end of last week containing the agenda and all of the details. I can pull that up and share it if you'd like.
Okay, so I saw two, and now there's a third.
I'd like to know the three, John, if that's all right.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Just give us the addresses quickly.
Pulling it up right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And just a little bit of a sidebar. It looks like Katie might have dropped her reception because she's no longer with us.
All right. Short-term rental wise, you have 8080 Clinton Street
Got it?
and a website that didn't finish loading. Bear with me.
Who is the
54
owner of
Maple.
80?
80 is Harkin Reader. Let me move on to the remote login and we'll get that for you.
And the other was a West Street address?
That was the property directly across the street from Hartwood College, correct?
Yep.
8892, I believe.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And
The
who's the
54
owner of that
Maples
one?
one.
54 Maple. Okay.
Who is the owner of the second one, Carrie?
I'm trying to remember. I remembered the address, not the name. I'm sorry. It's still loading. Does not bode well for the evening if we're starting with technical
No.
difficulties.
Yeah.
All right, Plan B. Okay. Just wait for it to open and we've got it.
Cut the air with a knife in here.
It's a nice awkward silence. All right, the other property is 88/92 West Street, Kristen and the Chinpin, out of Elmont, New York. And then the final property will be the Antonetti residence, 5454 Maple Street.
Yeah, that's a rental property. It's a student property. It's a multiple apartment building.
So it's a 54, and they're also applying for a short-term variance?
Yeah,
Okay.
Mhm.
And that is an apartment building?
yes, it's a student rental building.
An apartment building. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not a single-family residence.
No.
Okay, so we can get some clarification. Oh, well, I don't know if we need any clarification because these are legitimate variance requests going to the zoning committee or zoning board, right? The reason I wanted to bring it up is with the onset of the virus and baseball camps shutting down, I almost thought, and I hadn't seen a zoning board meeting scheduled in quite some time. And I just know that, in this particular application, it's happening. We're getting variance requests going to the zoning board, and the zoning board will be able to review the application, and they can rule accordingly. We have not discussed, and I understand why we haven't discussed it. It ceased being an urgent matter some time ago with the closures, because with the closures of the baseball camps, et cetera, it really seemed like we were not going to have very much in the way of short-term rentals. And it just kind of went off the radar in terms of the agenda. My recollection was that the legislative committee had, I'm not sure whether we stopped or there was frustration with how to proceed, whether this should be considered in some other way, but the zoning committee had been somewhat deadlocked in the consideration of opening the short-term rental code. So I just wanted to bring it up and see what folks had to say about our need, or the council's need, to work more with this particular code before variances perhaps, but variances are still going to be heard. The moratorium's over. So these are legitimate requests. What is everyone's thoughts on this? Can I hear one at a time?
John, I apologize. My mic was going a little bit screwy. Would you mind repeating the question?
What is the legislative committee meeting? What is the legislative committee's thoughts on short-term rental? We had kind of stopped discussing it, and it's coming up again because the variances are coming in again. So what are the thoughts that members of this committee have?
So I just wanted to ask a question, which is, I saw that it had been considered by previous council's legislation as it is on our desk. So I guess my question was, what were the concerns that kept it from passing? Maybe start there.
Hey, Katie, I can't hear you well. I don't know if anybody else has the same issue. Is there a way to?
Faint.
Same problem.
Yeah, are you on speaker with your phone or what? Is there a way to improve the sound?
Is that better?
That's
Yes.
better.
Okay, great. So my question was, okay, so I had read that councils in the past had previously considered the legislation as we have it. And I guess my question is, what
were their concerns with it or things that they wanted to see, because then we don't necessarily have to start from scratch.
David?
John, I guess that would mean for me to speak up since we're a committee of two for the last couple of years.
Mhm.
You know, and I reread, well, number one, Stephen, what you sent out today was the proposed legislation, correct?
Right. That was
Okay.
the last version that was put in front of the board.
Right. So, I mean, believe it or not, John and everybody else, there's a lot that I like about it. But the questions I have about it are, number one is how does increasing and allowing summer rentals or short-term rentals, how does that follow with the comprehensive plan? I already know that some of my other concerns were for Luke and Katie. I did some research with Lori Zimnowitz years ago where we literally counted the rental properties in every ward and came up with a percentage. And the third, the fourth, the 7th and 8th were already, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, we're already above 50% rental property. And the comprehensive plan really talks about improving housing, increasing rental housing, not short-term rental, but long-term rental housing, and bringing families back to Center City. So I don't know how increasing summer rentals allows for that. Although I see everybody's argument that we have a problem right now with short-term rentals and how we keep track of them. I still think even if we pass this, there's nothing that says that somebody who wants that variance, let's say they go and they apply for the short-term rental permit and they're denied because they don't qualify for it. There's nothing that says they can't go to the zoning board to ask for a variance. So I think it's a false argument saying that by passing this, we're going to have a reduced number of variance requests going to the zoning board. The other concern I have is actually right on my own street, across the street from me. There's a property that is owned by a local family, and they own another house on Goodyear Lake. This is their primary residence, and they live in this house for about 4 weeks a year. And actually right now they're illegally renting it out for the summer. They spend most of the year, about 11 months out of the year, on Goodyear Lake, and this house sits empty. But it's where it's their voter registration is at this house. It's their primary residence for all. And so this is a case where they could rent this house out and not be there because it's listed as their primary residence and they have a different place to go. So what do we do in a case like that where that could turn into a problem if we have a lot of issues like that? Because we do have a lot of families here in town that have a house over on Goodyear Lake and a house over here. So.
All right, let's keep that. Stephen, if you could address that, but I'd like to hear from the other two members of the committee before we go to that question. So Dave, your specific question is what to do with this particular property if someone wanted to rent it. Well, you were saying it's rented all through the summer, it's rented for the summer?
Well, this is the first year they've done it. And they came over and told me, well, we told the person that's in there is going to paint for us, so we're not charging anything. But he's going to paint the downstairs living room and live there for the summer. So I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop because I know they don't live in this house. It's an empty house most of the time, and they've been trying to rent it out. They're waiting for the short-term rental law to be passed so they can rent out this house.
If they're allowed to in zone 2.
If they're allowed to. And it is used as it's considered their primary residence. One of the members has been on one of our boards for years.
Okay, just a quick passing. If it's going to be rented for the summer, a 3-month period, it would not be a short-term rental, correct?
It's for 2 months.
I believe, I'll let the zoning guy. Stephen, is that a short-term rental or not?
No.
Anything less than 14 days.
Anything less than 14 days.
Mhm.
So this is
That's
for-
currently, right? That's what's the current law, right, Stephen?
That's the definition right now.
and the
is-
proposal was to anything less than 30 days.
Right.
Okay, so a 2-month rental would not be considered a short-term rental.
No.
I
Okay.
guess my point though, John, is what I see happening is them living in Goodyear Lake, using this as their primary residence, and then renting it out as short-term rental throughout the year, and it will never have a family there. When the reason for the new legislation was to allow people that want to rent their house out for a few weeks a year, and maybe go away on vacation while it's being rented out, they can do that to earn money to fix their house up. And that's the other thing. I think that those that really are going to rent their house out, they're really not using the money to fix their house up, because if their house needs fixing up, nobody's going to want to rent that house out anyway.
Okay, what I'd suggest is to move, rather than discuss that particular point, to hear from the other two folks, and then I'll talk a little bit about it. So, Katie, do you have some questions? You really want to? I mean, you had a question. Do you have adequate information to proceed, or do you want to ask more detail or get a more detailed answer?
No, I think just a couple things that kind of sprang to mind. One thing that had been kind of bouncing around in my brain is people who, I don't know, and I just quickly reread the legislation today, so I could completely be missing this, but what does it say to address, kind of to Dave's point, people who want to maybe have a second property for short-term rental income? Like, so say I own my house, it's my primary residence, and then also, I have a house in the 5th ward or whatever, and it's not my primary residence, and I just use that as a short-term rental.
You
That
can't do
doesn't-
that.
You
That
can't.
that wouldn't be allowed under the ordinance.
Okay. And then the other thing is just about the variances going to the zoning board. It might not reduce the number, but
Right.
I think that it would probably give them greater cause to say, no, this was already filtered through, the appropriate process, and you were told no for a reason. So we may not limit the number of variance applications, but I think we would probably limit the number of variances issued.
All right, Luke.
Yeah, I mean, mine's a little bit more of a kind of a bigger picture thing, and it's something it's just something I've been thinking about since this afternoon. Is especially after hearing those numbers that Dave gave, over 50% or at 50% is an enormous number. Obviously, is there? And again, I don't know if this is something that's kind of just been stirring up there, and I'm not really sure. I haven't really looked into it. Is there any way, other than obviously going before the zoning board, that, not arbitrarily, but after some deliberation, some study, is there any way that we can reduce the number of rentals? Is there a cap that we can put on them?
I'm going to say I suspect not, but Stephen,
So
is there any limit on a person being able to rent their house?
no, any house in the city can be used for rental property. There's
Okay.
no way to tell someone that a property can't be used as a rental property.
Okay.
Yeah, so in the city of Oneonta, in any district, in any zoning district, in any ward, any property can be used as a rental property.
That's the way the way the law is written right now, Stephen. That's true, but there's other cities that have had zoning overlays that allow only specific numbers of rental properties within a certain
So
certain area.
our zoning ordinance limits the number of multifamily dwellings it doesn't limit the number of single family homes that can be rented. So like theoretically, if I wanted to, I could finish my house on Cedar Street and then just turn it into a rental property. I could rent to a family, I could rent to college kids, I could rent to whoever I wanted. So yeah, I mean, as our zoning's written now, there's no limitation on single family rental units. There are limitations on multifamilies.
So I guess the question for you, Dave, was, and I know this was a while ago, were most of the properties that you saw were being used for short-term rentals when a while ago? Were they mostly multi-unit or single-family homes?
It was a mix of both, but none of them were for short-term rentals. Most of the vast majority were they were 12-month rental properties.
Okay.
So I do want to say one thing in reply to one thing Katie had said about the zoning meetings and the number of variances that come forward. Those variances, if they followed the OTTO rules regarding issuing a variance, almost none of those short-term rental properties would actually qualify. Currently, most of them would not qualify to get that variance. And one of the things we looked at over the last couple of years, we had a question for Stephen, going back, what was it, 8 years or 10 years, how many short-term rental variances were provided and given out? It was actually because we wanted to know, is this really a problem that we have here of short-term rental variances just being given out willy-nilly? And it looks on paper like it was really not an issue. There are very few that were granted in the R1, 2, and 3 zones. So that's all I got.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. And I think that's all I've got too, John. Just kind of sifting through. Let's do my thoughts.
Well, it's is Gary here? Gary Herzig?
Yeah, he's
Yes.
here.
He can't see you, Gary, but yeah, Gary's here.
Yes, I'm here. I'm here.
Have you anything you'd like to add?
Well, the only thing I want to add is that I was under the impression after talking to John that the purpose of this meeting was to review a specific proposal that Stephen had made a year or so ago to our legislation regarding short-term rentals. It's a bit complex and it was reviewed a few times and I don't think it was ever fully understood. I mean, I would step back away from the big picture for a minute and give Stephen an opportunity to explain what his proposal is, why he's proposing it, what impact he sees would result from it, and then take questions on it.
Okay. Stephen, if you could take a kind of a big picture and describe the options that are in your proposal, because I think there are options that are included there that we need to know about.
So the way this short-term rental process works in the city of Oneonta right now is we issue short-term rental permits. So someone that wants to do short-term rental in any of the zones that are not R1, 2, 3, and U are allowed to come to the code office and apply for a short-term rental permit. That application is reviewed administratively. And if it meets the criteria as far as it has a CSC, it hasn't had, multiple police encounters for noise violations, et cetera, we issue a short-term rental permit and they engage in short-term rental. Our definition in the city of Oneonta of a short-term rental property is a property that's being rented for less than 15 days on more than one occasion every 6 months. So the ongoing problem we've had is that in the zones where you cannot do short-term rental, we have people that do engage in short-term rental under the guise of, well, I rented it for 15 days, so it's not a short-term rental. It's considered an annual year-round rental property. We also have people that are like, well, I did it for 12 days this 6-month period and 12 days during this 6-month period. So I don't meet the definition. So I'm free of that as well. So the idea behind changing the definition to make it more restrictive, while at the same time allowing people that own their property and live there full time to do short-term rental, we're kind of trading, you know, we're balancing out a more restrictive definition in favor of a wider range of people being able to apply for a short-term rental permit. So the idea would be someone like me that lives in my house could theoretically come to the code office and apply for a short-term rental permit. I could then do short-term rental, and we wouldn't have to go in front of the zoning board to be like, I want to rent my house for 2 weekends in the summer. However, on the other hand, it would say anyone renting a property for less than 30 days, so that's 1 day, 2 days, whatever, is engaging in short-term rental and would be in violation of the city code. So in that world, if, let's say, I don't know, just any landlord decided they wanted to rent their house out for 2 days, we could say you're violating the code and we can issue a citation. Right now, we have to run around and be like, well, was it 2 days in a 6-month period? Is he renting it for 15 days? Because if he's renting it for 15 days, that's not really a code violation. So we do a lot of like running around, trying to like track down dates and times. And by making the definition more restrictive, anyone renting their property for more than a day is engaging in short-term rental. So it makes it easier for homeowners to rent their property if they choose to. It makes it harder for everyone else to rent those properties in the same way. That would be the idea.
And that would include R1 and R2.
That would include all the zones. So if you're a homeowner in any zone, you can say, code office, I would like to have an inspection of my home. I would like to have a furnace inspection, an electrical inspection. I'd like to go through all the paperwork process and all the fees and costs so I can rent my house for 2 days. You could do that. So it would be treated the same way as any other rental property in the city of Oneonta. It would just allow people like a homeowner to do that, and it would make it more difficult for potential landlords to do it by trying to come up with loopholes within the current definition.
And so in the current code, a permit is not needed for a homeowner for a certain period of time. Is that correct?
Yep. So
that would be removed. No one would be able to do any sort of a rental.
No one would be exempt.
Okay. And that would include something like an Airbnb rental?
That would include anyone renting any property for more than a day. So right now, if you do that, less than 14 days, once in a 6-month period, you don't have to do anything.
Yeah,
you can
exactly.
So this would remove that. The definition would be changed to anything less than 30 days. Any property listed for rent for less than 30 days is considered a short-term rental.
Okay.
John, I have a question for Stephen.
Sure.
Stephen, if this passes, what's the plan for monitoring Airbnb? Because I'm using that as an example because that's the big one where we see illegal rented properties. So what happens if somebody does not go and get that permit and we see their house on Airbnb, or are you going to be monitoring?
So we currently monitor Airbnb. We currently monitor probably 4 or 5 different rental, like home rental type places like that. One of the things written into the ordinance is that you would have to include your permit number on your Airbnb listing. So the idea is that we can then quickly go through these sites and say that they're not listing a permit. That would be a violation of the code as well.
I'm trying to get behind this, believe it or not. John may not believe me, but I am trying to get behind this because I see the importance of redoing the legislation because we have a lot of issues around this. But unfortunately, my neighbor is a prime example to me of one of the issues. So I'm looking through this and I'm wondering, under letter F, number 1, it says in R1, 2, 3, and U districts, the applicant must provide at least 3 of the following: motor vehicle registration, driver's license or equivalent ID card, voter registration, or tax documents showing the proposed short-term rental property is the primary residence or the permanent residence primary residence. So I'm wondering if there's some way, like letter D, where tax documents showing that the property is their primary residence for the purposes of a homeowner's tax exemption. If that is a requirement, that may actually cut down on what I see on my own street. Is there a way we can either say that it's required to have all 4, but then of course, if we require all 4, what if somebody doesn't have a car and they want to rent out their house? So do we need the motor vehicle registration as part of the requirements? I guess what I'm saying is I'd like to see letter D as an absolute requirement with this. And I know that voter registration is a great way of showing that it's a primary resident for somebody. And so is a driver's license. So I guess I could get behind it if we either do all 4, or to make it easier, just remove the motor vehicle registration. But I don't know what the impact would be on that. Maybe Stephen would have a better idea, but Stephen's gone.
His connection appears to have dropped.
Yeah.
Good questions, there, Dave.
Hopefully he'll jump back in, because I think since he wrote it, he's probably the only one to really answer that, unless anybody else has another idea why motor vehicle registration is a necessary one.
My only comment would be, and this might be a non-issue because I know the majority of folks do have a car, but from an accessibility standpoint, could it be any? I mean, I guess it would have to be a car registration, but could it be another form of identification if, per se, they didn't have a car? And I know I guess this would probably be mostly theoretical because
that's on there though, Luke. It's is driver's license and ID. Unless we separate it out where we have A, B, and C, you need 2 out of the 3, and you have to have the tax documents for the property.
Oh yeah, like your I-9.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't do my own taxes though, Katie. So I'm assuming that the I-9 is what I'm talking about. So that sounds good to me.
When you're hired by a company, they have to verify your identity.
Okay.
And so you can have one document, like a passport from list A, which is
That's exactly what I was thinking, Katie.
Okay.
Yeah, because that requires like multiple things to be able to apply for a passport. So they assume if you have a passport, you've already provided these documents, or you can have 2 things from list B or C. So it's like that, like you kind of weight the requirements as like, this is a more serious one. And if you don't have that, then you can do 2 or 3 of these other ones.
Stephen looks like he's back. Stephen, are you there?
Yeah, I'm back.
Okay, just to say quickly what my question was, is I was looking, like I really want to get behind this because I see the changes are necessary. But if you go under the legislation, letter F, 1,
Yep.
Those 4 items, I feel like the tax document might seriously reduce the issue I see with my neighbor with what's happening on my street. What I was proposing is either we require all 4, but then requiring motor vehicle registration, I don't know if that would be a hindrance to some people or not. And if so, tease out that so we have you need 2 out of 3 of A, B, and C, and you have to show the tax documents, letter D. Like have D be an absolute.
Yeah, that's easy.
Yeah,
I think Go
I
ahead.
mean, because we're the ones writing it. I mean, we can write in whatever we want. I mean, that's the thing. So, yeah, I mean, I just put those as examples of what other municipalities have done to kind of filter these for primary. So, like San Francisco has they have an entire wing of their code office that all they do is deal with Airbnb. That's their only
I
job.
believe it.
And this is kind of modeled after what they require for their residency requirement, because they allow even rental units there. So like, let's say you're renting an apartment, you can put it up for Airbnb if you want. So they require some of that same documentation to show primary residency, even if you're a renter. But yeah, I mean, we can write whatever we want into that. I mean,
Because I believe with the new tax law, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you can only write off the mortgage of one property. Is that correct? Does anybody know?
so we were basing it off of like a star exemption. Like if you're getting a star exemption, if you're getting some sort of, you can only list one property.
Yeah, I think that's what changed with the new tax law. So you can't have two homes, two mortgages, and write them both off. So that's the direction I'm going for with this. So you can have two homes, claim that telling the city that one is your primary property, and have your driver's license at that location, and your taxes saying that the other one is, or something like that. So I guess if we did something like that, where we at least require the tax document listing that primary residence as for the purposes of the homeowner's tax exemption, I could get behind it. But I just, before we put it forward to the council, I'd like to see how that looks first.
Yeah.
John, is that all right with you? Honestly, I'm not thrilled with this, but I know we have to have an answer to this.
Well, just a couple of things. I'm uncomfortable, great word, about the example based on your neighbor. Because I have people in my neighborhood. I would like to have the opportunity, because they've reinvested, improved the homes dramatically, and have taken at least one blighted home next door to me to stop being blighted and being a desirable property that people want to rent. And my neighbor says, geez, I'd hate to get tied up. Well, that's all. She has asked me about, do I have a problem with this particular short-term rental? I have none. And so we are in different neighborhoods with different opinions about a particular place. So
well, is that her primary residence, John?
Huh?
Is that her primary residence?
No.
Well, she wouldn't be able to rent it under this law anyway.
She wouldn't, not in R2. Stephen probably could tell the story of chutzpah, which is dominating this, which is basically somebody saying, this is how I rent them. And Stephen, I don't even know how to, Stephen, are you able to enforce anything under these conditions?
I mean, the current ordinance, most people comply with just because they opt to comply.
Sure.
We have very limited success enforcing the short-term rental ordinance as it's currently written, because there's a lot of loopholes. It kind of causes a lot of issues when it comes to enforcement.
Yeah. This is just reawakening for me, the difficulty. And I'm not even sure where people on council, where they stand on this. Broadly wanting to encourage it, wanting to keep the law pretty much the way it is, whether to change it so Stephen would have more of a more enforcement potential. I'm just not sure. I've heard people on the council saying in their ward it's an open issue. They would be fine to have more short-term rentals. So I'm not sure where we are as the legislative committee. We could certainly not hold this up and bring it further to council, because I think we're operating as a four-person committee trying to sort something out where we have our own differences.
John, well, you know as well as I do, each ward is very different. I mean, Luke's ward is extremely different than Katie's ward and my ward.
I believe they're both R2s.
No, I'm talking about just the general makeup of the neighborhood.
But there's no difference between the R2. These three neighborhoods are all under the umbrella of an R2 classification. Yours is not a gated community, nor is mine a gated community.
I think
we operate
Ward
under
1
the same
is
laws.
actually an R1. It's a less congested area.
Yes, it is. That's an
Right.
R1.
So that's an R1. I believe I'm R2, and so is Katie's neighborhood. It's an R2. So they're different.
So, as is mine. I'm not talking about R1s unless we opened it up to also include short-term rentals in R1.
Okay, my whole point, John, was I don't agree with moving this legislation forward until we look at making the change that I was asking for early on, which is really a minimal change. I thought that was a compromise, because I realized that this is an issue. And as far as what the rest of the council thinks, I mean, I feel like that's a moot point until we come to an agreement in the committee and agree to move something forward.
The only difficulty I have with that is having four people on a committee. In a sense, holding it up in committee until the four of us are satisfied in moving it forward to the council. I haven't heard anything from council in months and months, when we've only been around for 7. What the general perception is. This has been going on for quite a while. Now, again, the reason I brought this for this discussion is I personally wasn't sure about the legislative committee. Well, I don't know. I've at other times saying we can't hold up proposed legislation until all four of us are satisfied with it.
So are you, go ahead, Katie, sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, we really can't, if John, if you wanted to bring this and put it on the council agenda, you know, that's within your right as a city council member. So we could talk about it on Tuesday if you want to. What I was just gonna say is it sounds like we're talking a lot about the zones of the city and less about the use and the targeted groups for this, like who would be using this legislation. So it sounds like, Dave, like you have kind of one thing, and so we're talking about people who it's their primary residence and they want to rent it, and it seems like that this legislation is good for that. And then I think, John, you're bringing in another target group, which is people who, and this is sort of what I was alluding to, are going to fix up a house and want to use it as income. I think we need to figure out who the people are who short-term legislation is going to impact, and then develop legislation that relates to each of those groups. And it may be more than those two, but I don't think that we're going to fit both of those groups into a single piece of legislation. So, because I think, John, you have a point. People who do Airbnb, like I use Airbnb, right? And I'm not staying in a dump. Like I'm looking at it. I want to see all the pictures. I want to read all the 5-star reviews. So people who are doing Airbnb for income, like your neighbor, and it's not their primary residence, they're still improving our housing stock. So I think that does, Dave, to your point, go toward the comprehensive plan. It may not be the way that we want it to happen, but if we can get the houses fixed up, then eventually when they go back on the market, they're in better condition. I see that as a win-win. So my suggestion—
But John's example doesn't fall under the legislation that's been proposed, though. That's
Right.
the
So
thing.
that's what I'm saying is my suggestion is we look at this legislation for who it's targeting, which is the primary residents of the city of Oneonta. It's their primary residence. This is the house that they pay taxes on, or that they claim on their taxes or whatever. And we recognize that for what it is. And then we can say, okay, we want to add on to our short-term rental legislation for other scenarios, because I don't think that we're going to get a perfect, like, magic bullet, one size fits all piece of legislation when we have different groups that we're trying to make this work for. So for me, I think we need to just pull this back, kind of like the mayor said, and say, okay, so this is for the target that's like Dave's neighbor, and then maybe address something different for the people like live in John's neighborhood. Does that make sense to everyone? Is that feasible, Stephen?
So the intent of this legislation was in response to the number of complaints we get about mostly student rental being used for short-term rental in the summer. The goal with this legislation was to basically compromise, allowing owner-occupied properties throughout the city, people like me or Dave or Katie or John, to use our property in a more flexible manner, but at the same time to restrict our rental properties from being like just year-round tourist camps. That was the compromise we made, which is where the definitions and kind of the process of this legislation came from. I think it would be fairly difficult to write a piece of legislation that allows some people to do some stuff and some people to not do other stuff based on arbitrary rules about, I mean, we would have to write essentially like separate ordinances for each ward or each neighborhood. So yeah, I think I think you're always going to have kind of a square peg, circle hole scenario where some people are going to fall through the cracks both ways. I mean, this was just meant to be kind of a compromise to allow more people to do something and restrict kind of the problems that we've had with some of these problem properties.
Just to state again, and we're going to be running out of time, and that is there are variances being requested now, 3 coming up in the next zoning board meeting. I have looked at 2 of those properties. The one on West Street, seems to me fitting for a variance because it's a relatively or very isolated property, which although in zone 2, it's really doesn't affect a neighbor. So I can understand the zoning board permitting that one because it's an unusual property that happens to be zoned in a way that makes it seem like part of a neighborhood. Whereas 1 block away on Clinton, this is a particular house which is locked in the middle of an R2 residence block. Quite different. So I'm not sure what the request is based on, but we have the wild card of the zoning board being able to make its decisions around variances. And I believe that the law in part was, Stephen would be able to speak to this. If we change the law, variances would not be an issue any longer. Would that be correct?
That's incorrect. The zoning board of appeals ultimately, we can't outzone the zoning board of appeals. The zoning board of appeals is expected to follow what's understood to be state and local ordinance and guidelines as to how they issue variances. Mm-hmm. So we can never outzone the zoning board of appeals because that's literally why they exist, is to hear appeals.
Yeah, exactly.
The idea behind this would be that primarily, single family or owner occupied properties wouldn't have to seek variances. They could instead just come get a permit if they choose to do short-term rental. But you're never going to outzone the zoning board of appeals. I mean,
Okay.
it's impossible.
But if this code was in place, there would be the grounds for a variance wouldn't be moot. They'd be moot.
Yeah, I mean, the idea would be that there's an administrative process to get a permit for essentially everyone in the city except the landlord.
Mm-hmm.
It basically restricts people that aren't owner occupied properties from getting short-term rental permits in those R1, 2, 3, and U zones.
Okay, we have about 8 minutes left. How to proceed? I don't think we have. Well, what do other members of the board want to do, given the lack of time to reach a conclusion?
Well, John, I would request that we make the changes to that one section, and then I would be willing to move it forward and vote for it in council.
John, if I may, I am fine with Dave's suggestion. I think Stephen makes a really good point. I think this is a way to close some of those loopholes and really kind of advance what we're trying to do, is make it a more livable city, with the acknowledgement that there is no such thing as a perfect piece of legislation. Unfortunately, there will be instances where things aren't always working out. That being said, I am comfortable moving it forward with council, and if it's okay, if our committee is okay with going back and revising it to what Dave would like, I'm fine with that as well.
Yeah, likewise.
Okay, we'll move this forward.
Yeah,
For
so
council?
I'll
We have to
make
make the changes.
Yeah, I'll make the changes and send them to the group.
Okay, can you send that to us well before council, Stephen? So
Yeah,
we can just
it'll
make
take
sure.
me, I'll do it tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
So if there are, and that's going to us, why is it going to us before it goes to council? Are we going to do a further edit while we're not in session?
I was under the impression that everyone was comfortable with the edit that Dave came up with for this to go to council.
I'm not comfortable with it, but I'm just procedurally saying I don't want to do edits that are not public, and just move
Okay.
on to the council, because then we'll be discussing it in council. And I may very well say, nah, I don't agree with that, which is my right as a council member, as all of us are. But I brought this up to start a ball rolling, not necessarily to start a landslide.
Well, the changes that I was suggesting was changing F1, and this meeting is recorded, so it becomes public. F1, change that to in R1, 2, 3, and U districts, the applicant must provide at least 2 of the following: either A, motor vehicle registration; B, driver's license or equivalent ID card; C, voter registration. And in addition, the applicant must provide D, tax documents showing the proposed short-term rental property as the permanent residence primary residence for the purposes of a homeowner's tax exemption. So that's the change, and now it becomes public knowledge, even though it's not written. So I believe that's the change that Stephen is looking to make. Correct, Stephen?
Yeah, that was what I
Okay.
understood us to be talking about.
Okay.
And so essentially we're opening with this, opening R2 and R1 to be open for short-term rentals under these conditions. If you're a long-term resident, you can demonstrate that in whatever way satisfies us, then R2 and R1 housing can be now short-term rentals.
And R3 and U districts.
I'm not concerned about them because they already are, except it's changing the term of the short-term rental. But the unit, people in R2s need to know that they can, if they are long-term residents and can demonstrate that, they can have short-term rentals. Is that correct?
Yeah, the idea behind it would be they could apply for a permit, like, so they would have to then agree to go through the entire administrative process that we require to issue that permit.
Of course.
So,
But the change is that variances are no longer an issue for this, because a person who's a long-term resident, long-term resident, permanent resident, though none of us are permanent, R2 is open and R1 is open now for short-term rentals under certain circumstances.
that would
Correct?
be correct. That would be correct.
Okay. Fine. That's
John,
fine.
before you close,
Yes,
can I
please.
just get a couple minutes from this group to bring up a totally unrelated issue that just came
Absolutely.
up? Thank you. And I know we're running late, Carrie, but I'll be fast. This might even be a better issue for the planning committee, but because of timing, it just came up. I wanted to see if what this group thought. I've had a request from some local individuals that want to do a display of photographs of people African Americans who died in police custody. This is something that has been shown in other cities, and they've been able to obtain the graphics from the other cities. They've looked for different places to put it, and they want to do Muller Plaza, but they want to put it on an existing fence. The rail in Muller Plaza is owned by the Clarion, so that really is not a good location. So they've asked if they can put it on the rail on Main Street that fronts the Westcott lot. We actually have no legislation, no permits, no code in our code to permit people to put a display on a fence. So I would go to the council to say, is this something that the council wanted to grant permission? It would be a short-term display, probably up for less than a week. And they wanted to put it up. Hopefully they'll be flexible. Their date that they were looking for was July 25th, if possible. If not, they'll be flexible. Any thoughts on that?
I don't see that there would be an issue if we're saying that it's a short-term action by the council. I don't see that we are inhibited from doing that. Others?
No, I'm fine with it. I think it's yeah, that sounds good to me.
I don't have any issues with it if it's short term, but what do we do about, well, I think we need to come up with some kind of legislation for future occurrences, because what happens if we have lots of other groups wanting to do something similar? And I know in the past we had an issue where somebody thought it was a great idea to leave out winter clothing on the fence along Main Street in various places for homeless people to take. And it became a problem years ago. So I'm okay with it, but I think we need to come up with legislation to really cover that down the road.
Yeah, so it'd be two separate issues. One, because we don't have any legislation now on this, it would be the council's ability to grant permission for this event. There's nothing prohibiting it. There's nothing allowing it. And certainly if this committee wanted to look at something for the future to define things like this, that'd be a separate matter. But, you know, are you comfortable me putting it on the agenda for the next council meeting to approve? I would get the details sent to me, you know, in writing of what the event is going to include and look like, and send it on if you're comfortable with me putting it on the agenda for next meeting.
I'm comfortable with that.
I am too, Gary.
Yep, that's fine.
Katie, are you okay with it, Katie?
Yeah, I kind of share Dave's concerns just about, if we're allowing groups to display on public property, we can't restrict free speech. So I worry about the precedent that we set. God forbid we were approached by a hate group, and
Mhm.
what do we do then? So I think, I just think we have to think about it from all angles, but I would be happy to talk about it with the full council for sure.
Keep in mind that really what they would want to do is do this on Muller Plaza, which we have a process for that. They would apply for a permit. However, what they're doing requires an existing fence in order to post it on. So if this was something that was self-standing, they would go through the normal process of applying for a permit. This is just different because we've never had anybody say we need an existing fence to put it on.
I'd certainly like Dave Merzick to just chime in on this about the possibilities. He's kind of the person who can answer that question. What can go wrong?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we'll do that.
And if it's a
but
casual thing and we don't have protesters tearing them down or wanting to have an equal voice on the other side of the street, let one,
Well,
got to let all.
Right. Well, it's no different than we have a permit process now for Muller Plaza or for any place else. If Black Lives Matter wants a permit for Muller Plaza, we would grant it. If somebody wants a permit to do a hate group rally, we would not grant it because hate crimes, are not permitted.
There's a difference between hate groups and people who want to fly a perfectly legitimate old flag from the Confederacy and say this honors and respects the honored dead at Gettysburg, to quote Lincoln.
Absolutely, John. No, absolutely. But my point was, probably I didn't say it properly. My point was that it would be no different than what we would deal with in our current permitting process. That we have, our current permitting process doesn't differentiate based upon what position somebody has, unless it's illegal.
I'm fine to discussing at council and hearing about what the possible downsides might be. That's all. Others? Okay, we're 4 minutes into finance time. So
Okay.
Thanks,
I'd like
everybody.
to see if I can get into that. If I'm not there, somebody call me. I'm having problems.